Before I begin, I would highly recommend you guys to check out Robin Gaming's video from 5 years ago, the one that talks about Naughty Dog's agenda at that time, Neil Druckmann and The Last of Us. It's crazy how relevant it is today. Also, I'll have timestamps for each topic down in the description, so feel free to, check out whatever interests you the most. But let's get into the video. Naughty Dog has just announced a PlayStation 5 remastered version for The Last of Us Part 2, and fans rightly so, criticizing whether the team at Naughty Dog, with all the talent that they possess, should be focusing on remakes and remasters when they could be amping up their work on new IP, maybe reboot Uncharted, and even if you love The Last of Us that much, how about some Factions news? But we're only gonna focus on one point specifically, Neil Druckmann. His influence and overgrowing hand in day-to-day affairs with where Naughty Dog is at, and his opinions, political views, agendas being pushed hard in the recent media coming to anything attached with Naughty Dog. But to better understand all this, like I mentioned earlier, go and watch that video first and the one afterwards, as it lays the groundwork for what we're talking about here. I'll only build over that because it's common knowledge.
Hi, I'm Bruce. I have some news I'd like to share.
The discourse surrounding all of this has much to do with how Bruce Straley, the original creator of The Last of Us, who doesn't get enough credit, matter of fact, he doesn't get any credit for the first Last of Us at all. He's one of the main reasons the first game did so well. Neil's eventual rise from just a designer to getting full sequel control for The Last of Us didn't just pop out of nowhere. It was Uncharted 4. Uncharted Lost Legacy, and then The Last of Us Part 2. The red flags were always there. This is not to degrade or play down his achievements. The man is clearly talented and has a good eye for greater levels and a good blend of storytelling and gameplay, but his obsession with the quote-unquote breaking barriers and pushing certain agendas is why we're all here. I'm all for that. Some of my favorite games have seen boundaries pushed, female leads, POC characters, that people of color representation, and all that. I'm here for it. I'm advocating for it. But there's a way to achieve all this. Calling anyone who criticizes The Last of Us Part 2 and the way the lore is set up and structured is deemed and named homophobes and toxic and many other words. First Last of Us actually sets up Ellie as a guaranteed female lead for the second game. It tackles many other aspects such as Frank and Bill, Henry and Sam, not to mention many political aspects hidden underneath such as fireflies, fighting the army after the apocalypse raged all over the world, specifically in the United States. We get to see many aspects that can be deemed progressive, handled with care, not pushed, organically intermingled in the story, but was always secondary compared to Joel, his story, and his relationship with Ellie. And I'll always give credit to both Neil and Bruce for that. More so Bruce, but that's neither here nor there. We all know what happened in Uncharted 4 with Nadine. That didn't pop out of nowhere, alright? Then the shipping posts being liked by Neil, being retweeted related to Nadine and Chloe, when both the plot and the story neither asks for it, nor it has anything to do with it. Again, nothing wrong with it, Major, but it just shows you where the focus is, rather where it should be. Nothing major here, but we move to Last of Us 2, and all of a sudden, there's a change in how Neil and the Naughty Dog is approaching the interviews, the marketing for this game. All of a sudden, an aggressive tone is being used by Neil. If you look at the PSX panel or any interview that comes after that, leading up to that day when we saw the major leaks for The Last of Us Part 2, it was always evident that Neil Druckmann would choose things he wanted to see in a game rather than adding elements that made sense for the story of Ellie and Joel, because remember, he literally said himself, they are his words, that The Last of Us is Ellie and Joel, and he can't imagine a Last of Us without them.
Really, The Last of Us is about these two characters.
Yet in Part 2, Ellie and Joel take a major backseat. Again, you're going to be like, Smack, what are you talking about? We had flashbacks. What are you talking about? We play as Ellie like half the game. What are you talking about? Allow me to explain. There is more to it. Uncharted 4 Nadine, Uncharted 4 development, letting go of Amy. It had already set up a pattern and structure that shouldn't have surprised any of us. It was evident that Naughty Dog was more focused on pushing certain agendas as opposed to writing human characters. The departure of Amy, or rather let go of Amy and Bruce, should have sent red flags everywhere. Instead of writing stories that has soul, we're getting a checklist done. Abby is the result of a work that was started with Uncharted 4 Nadine. Lev from The Last of Us Part 2 is the result of work that started with Left Behind DLC. And most important, the Wolves and the Seraphites, the fight between them, is the result of Neil Druckmann pushing his own opinions, ideologies, and cultural beliefs onto his own creations as in video games. Now, on the surface, understand, it's not that big of a deal. Many directors, writers in Hollywood, for movies and TV shows, they do that all the time. Whether it be main characters, side characters, whether it be popular IP or a new one. But when that becomes the core aspect, when you're trying to push a certain agenda as opposed to creating stories that matter, stories that has some soul, it just takes away the focus from what made your story universally good and praisable. That's just them pushing agendas and taking a political stand, or being politically correct. Or not in this case, rather than making good games. Many people will come here and talk about the narrative of the story, its problem with how the story was structured, how the focus from Joel and Ellie was shifted and not enough to care about other matters, including Abby, how the inclusion of some of the characters was forced, and how the whole revenge thing just didn't work out as they were hoping. But I want to talk about everything underneath the surface, everything leading up to the game being a disaster, and Naughty Dog where it's at right now. Now understand, controversy sells, so they'll be fine, okay? They'll be fine in selling millions of copies. Last of Us Part 2 Remaster, it'll be fine in selling copies. But I want to talk about, again, what's underneath the surface. Neil Druckmann is an Israeli-American video game developer, someone who's very passionate about his opinions, whether it be politics, culture, and most importantly his work. Getting free reign after his work in Uncharted and The Last of Us meant he was getting promoted up in the company. It was just a matter of time. And getting a completely free hand in what was the most important project in Naughty Dog's company, The Last of Us Part 2. It'd be one thing for me to just sit here, speculate, as many of you might be wondering, but Neil has come forth and confirmed many points himself on podcasts, interviews, articles, etc., both for The Last of Us Part 2 and for the HBO show. All of the mentioned earlier points meant The Last of Us Part 2 became Neil's personal playground, at least from an outsider perspective. Let me clear myself here. Let's start with the first point, Joel and Ellie. They became PlayStation icons. Alright, that paved the way for Horizon Zero Dawn, Aloy, and many others. For The Last of Us Part 2, their story took a gigantic turn in Part 2. If it were structured properly, this could have been a great love and revenge story. Many anecdotes are thrown around, such as redemption, love, forgiveness, living. But Neil made it clear from the get-go that this story is about hate. Universal hate. Ellie's hatred for Joel for what he's done, Abby's hatred for Joel for what he's done, Liv's hatred for Scars for what they've done, Liv's hatred for his mother, Wolf's hatred for Scars. But let's dial it back. Start from the beginning. Because if you think I'm waffling, here are some of the points that have been in my head ever since I played Part 2 years ago. Dina was Ellie's girlfriend in Part 2. She came out of nowhere. She all of a sudden knew survival skills. There's a love triangle with Jesse that you couldn't care less about, and all of us, it seems so random. But when the main story of the revenge starts, Dina is paired with Ellie. There's no mention of what makes her so different for Ellie. Why are they together? Her survival skills that makes her so good in the field, but none of that matters, as one of the first thing they do when the main story starts, and it is a main objective, by the way, not a side mission that you can, do it optionally, is to explore this place called the Dome, which is actually, if you go inside, is a synagogue, and Dina is revealed to be of Jewish faith. We are then forced to listen to her story and explore it as its main objective. Again, nothing wrong with tackling something like that, but forcing Dome here, obviously, Iron Dome, nothing surprising here. It's minor from a larger perspective. I need to make this clear. It would have been the same thing if it was a church and Dina was a Christian, but you won't see a mosque or a mention of a Muslim in these communities. But that's neither here nor there. I mean, I'm just gonna put it out there. Insomniac put a lot of representation, actual representation, people from all faiths in their games. Even Cyberpunk does it, man. But coming back to Dina, she's eventually written out of the story shortly after this, and then, brought back later on to further Tommy's plot with Ellie. It's very... make that of what you will. Now let's talk about probably the most important point. I need you all to bear with me. With the surface of Joel and Abby's storyline, the game's main lore underneath that takes the center stage is Wolves versus Seraphites, Washington Liberation Front, who's at ongoing war with another group known as Scars or Seraphites. It is important to know how the game is perceiving both groups, how are they being treated from each side, and from an outside perspective as well. This conflict here is actually one of the most interesting part of the entire storyline, and you kind of feel like, hey, I want to know more about this. So let's talk about it. Wolves, or WLF, is mostly a paramilitary organization. They have a lot of militant weaponry, whereas Seraphites, known as Scars, they are deemed as fanatics, a religious cult. Their wording, not mine. Now, to understand, WLF are different from Fedra. They're not part of it. They themselves fought Fedra to get out of the military hold, and from there on out, we got Scars, history with the WLF, each fighting the other for multitude of reasons. We got the control of territory, revenge for killing members, etc. There's a whole history here that you can read, learn, and observe as an outsider from Ellie's perspective. There was an article written by Vice titled The Not-So-Hidden Israeli Politics of The Last of Us Part 2, and it basically explains and exposes the themes, its inspirations by taking direct quotes from Neil Druckmann himself, and how the cycle of violence theme itself, the conflict between WLF and Scars, is taken directly from the Palestine-Israeli conflict. I want to put this on record, that the writer of this article, very early on, makes it clear that he grew up in Israel. So, I quote,
I suspect that some players, if they consciously clock the parallels at all, will think The Last of Us Part 2 is taking a balanced and fair perspective on that conflict, humanizing and exposing flaws in both sides of its in-game analogs. But as someone who grew up in Israel, I recognized a familiar, firmly Israeli way of seeing and explaining the conflict, which tries to appear even-handed and even enlightened, but in practice marginalizes Palestinian experience in a manner that perpetuates a horrific status quo. The game's co-director and co-writer Neil Druckmann, an Israeli who was born and raised in the West Bank before his family moved to the US, told the Washington Post that the game's themes of revenge can be traced back to the 2000 killing of 2 Israeli soldiers by a mob in Ramallah. Some of the gruesome details of the incident were captured on video, which Druckmann viewed. In his interview, he recounted the anger and desire for vengeance he felt when he saw the video, and how he later reconsidered and regretted those impulses, saying they made him feel gross and guilty. But it gave him the kernel of a story.
This is a point that he would reiterate in HBO's The Last of Us podcast. Neil Druckmann, an official The Last of Us game podcast, and in multiple interviews after The Last of Us 2's release, when there was pandemic all over and people were doing Zoom interviews and whatnot. But going back to the article,
I landed on this emotional idea of, can we, over the course of the game, make you feel this intense hate that is universal in the same way that unconditional love is universal? Druckmann told the Post. This hate that people feel has the same kind of universality. You hate someone so much that you want them to suffer in the way they've made someone you love suffer.
The article then calls out how the level design is directly inspired by Israeli-Palestine conflict.
The Last of Us Part 2's main setting of Seattle is visually and functionally defined by a series of checkpoints, security walls, and barriers. There are many ways to build and depict structures that separate and keep people out. Just Google US-Mexico border wall to see the variety of structures on the southern border of the United States alone. The Last of Us Part 2's Seattle doesn't look like any of these. Instead, it looks almost exactly like the tall, precast concrete barriers and watchtowers Israel started building through the West Bank in 2000.
The article then talks about how the Wolves vs. Scars is portrayed in-game lore and how it is taken from direct, real-life conflict and stereotype. But most specifically, it mentions how, quote, from an Israeli perspective rather than an unbiased, outside, even-handed perspective.
In one in-game note, a Fedra commander in Seattle writes to Central Command to explain that he has lost the city to the Wolves, which he describes as terrorists. Here, there are parallels to early Zionist organizations that fought British rule in the region. These organizations were also described as terrorists, and leaders of those organizations later became leaders in Israel, much like how Isaac, the leader of the Wolves, came to control Seattle. Other in-game notes, scenes of urban ambushes, and the bodies of executed Fedra officers laboriously walk the player through the cliché, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter.
Now we talk about scars and how they're portrayed by means of stereotypes as Palestinians.
The dynamic in the city when the game begins is one of conflict, escalation, and a broken truce. The Wolves, like Fedra, leverage more resources and raw power, while the Scars rely on surprise strikes against wolf patrols and a zealous willingness to die for the cause. To run through just a few key ways in which the Scars uncomfortably reflect some Israeli stereotypes about Palestinians. The same note from the Seattle Fedra commander that bitterly says the Wolves are in charge explains that it's now their responsibility to not only feed and shelter the people of Seattle, but deal with the religious fanatics, referring to the Scars. Later in the game, Ellie finds a location called Martyr Gate, where the Scars' spiritual leader apparently died, indicating a religious significance of a specific and disputed location, and emphasizing the notion of martyrdom as central to their culture. The Scars are able to get around wolf patrols and various barriers around the city via an elaborate, secret system of bridges between skyscrapers. These function as a kind of flipped version of the underground tunnels Palestinians use to bypass Israeli blockades and other means of limiting free movement in order to get supplies and carry out attacks on Israel.
It is scary how close to reality and from a single perspective this conflict is written. It is now more relevant than ever. One statement really caught my attention.
This conflict comes to a head when Isaac decides to push deep into the Scars' land to finish them once and for all. We don't get to see how the battle ends or who comes out on top, but we see Isaac die in the fighting and get the sense that the battle is so brutal and bloody, whatever survives is not worth keeping.
Understand, this is from Abby's point of view, who is part of Wolves, while the Wolves are fighting Scars on their land to eventually end this once and for all. I'm not making this up, bro. Go and play the game. It is more relevant than ever. The story does pair you up with someone from the Scar side, so they can really make it even-handed for Ellie to be like, oh, this is from both perspective. But we'll get to how tone-deaf and hollow this approach is from Naughty Dog's No Winners in the War story.
Seattle is so clearly inspired by Israel and Palestine, without naming either, but it does notably spend time presenting Jewish identity. One of the first things Ellie and Dina do when they arrive in Seattle is explore a former synagogue. It's a short scene, maybe 20 minutes out of a 30-plus hour game, and it serves as a kind of a Jewish experience amusement park ride, bombarding the player with references and history as Dinah and Ellie walk around a bima, find a Torah, and so on. Almost the entirety of this section is spent explaining Jewish identity as that of survivors in the face of other groups that want to destroy them. In the span of those 20 minutes, there are 3 separate references to the Holocaust. It spends a significant amount of time telling the player that Jews are always persecuted and fighting for survival. This is not wrong, but it is serving a specific purpose in the ham-fisted allegory about Israel and Palestine that is The Last of Us Part 2. Much like the Holocaust is cynically leveraged by some to justify Israel's actions.
This point of Dina actually mirrors what Neil and the team, because it would be unfair to put all of this on Neil. I mean, you're telling me all the creatives and none of the team member be like, hey, yo, Neil, aren't we doing a little too one-sided? So when I'll say it, Neil and the team wrote for the character Lev, who joined Abby for survival from his own group. We already mentioned how Scars are portrayed as almost non-humans, fanatics, cultish. It is so narrow-minded approach they did with Seraphites. I mean, look at the design of these characters compared to the Wolves. The design of these characters, like, it's literally non-human. People, actual real people are designing this. I will call out Naughty Dog for masking many points, such as having a woman as a prophet, to mask the fact that these Scars, these Seraphites, are representing Palestinians in this conflict. Because one of the main chants you'll hear in Palestine, in real life, a nation led by Muhammad, peace be upon him, will not surrender. Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the final prophet and the messenger in Islam for Muslims. But we're not here to discuss or debate about religion. We're here to merely look at how Naughty Dog and the team is presenting one side as literal non-humans, whereas the whole point of this conflict, even in the game, is to showcase how in war there's no winner. How about instead of making them total fanatics and just stopping at that, you explore, as Lev and Abby, why do these people, Scars, Seraphites, believe the way they believe in what they believe so passionately? Why do they do that? What separates them compared to Wolves or any other group or faction? How did this war started? Show us day-to-day life of these people, because at the end of the day, even if you're atheist, or even if you're from a religion, the people on the other side, the people who don't believe the same as you, are also human beings. They're also living lives the way it makes sense to them, the way they think is the right way of living. So why? But if you think I'm stretching here, if you're thinking I'm really grasping at straws, there is an in-game dialogue where Abby, who's representing IDF in this scenario, and again, not my words, outright says, and I quote, "Maybe they shouldn't throw stones at us." Prior to the current events in Palestine, the ones that are going on right now, majority of the times you'll see in news kids throwing rocks as a sign of resistance towards IDF soldiers. One detail that an article by Overland calls out.
Throughout the game, we see WLF members complain about Seraphite kids breaking truces by throwing rocks at armed guards and death cult Seraphites making things worse by not staying on their island.
Come on, man. If it's still not obvious now, I don't know what will. Continuing the Scar's point, you spend time with Abby and her friends, and they're shown as people that are fighting for what's right. They're fighting this cult. They just want peace. They broke the truce. Look at how good they people are. They want to liberate. Now, I don't have an issue if that was your whole point, Naughty Dog. I would not have an issue. Well, the issue would have been different, but at least it would have been understandable, because you want to present Wolves as the superior one or the right one in this conflict. But you clearly went out of your way to make sure that both sides are trying to do what's right. Both sides are just trying to, live in peace. But the whole theme, and you're saying that the whole theme here is even-handed, unbiased, result of cycle of violence, eye for an eye, leave the whole world blind. Yet only one side is portrayed somewhat human, whereas everyone else in Scars is portrayed as religious extremists. Again, even if from your point of view, it's true, even if you believe that's true, it is still not fair to not give Scars a somewhat believable story. So you might be wondering, okay, Smack, what are you doing? We got Yara and Lev, and we do spend time in Scars camp. Okay, here's my point. The only reason we get some form of Scars point of view from their side as well, Lev was there once again for my earlier point to get a checklist done. Gender identity. I'm gonna call it out for what it is, alright? Let's not beat around the bush. And again, I would have no issue if that was your main point. Yara was put there to balance it out as someone, who wants to support Lev. At the same time, she believes in what Scar believes. Even after what happened in the camp, even after whatever happened with Lev, or should I say to Lev, she was still a believer in whatever the camp Seraphites believed. She just only wanted to protect Lev from her mother and the Seraphites. But she believed. Why did she believe? What is her thought process? What's her psychology? Yara had a very small role, but she turned out to be a much more interesting character than Lev. And the only reason they added Yara is, again, like I mentioned, but also, look at how insane this is. Abby and Wolves have this entire storyline planned with Joel from Wolves' perspective. I'm not talking about when they were upping for revenge. No, I'm not talking about that. That made sense, right? I would have loved to see Joel's take on Seraphites and Wolves and whatnot, but that's neither here nor there. But look at how, from Owen, Mel, and everybody, they're shown from their side this war, this conflict of Wolves and Scars. It is portrayed from one side only, Wolves. Even if Abby didn't want anything to do with that after she got Lev, it was still one-sided show. So you got all these friends and entire storyline, and Scars get One, and even there it is forced. And spoilers, Yara dies, so the only side you're left with is Lev, and his inclusion is solely forced for one point. Like I mentioned, they didn't even try to make him interesting. They didn't even try to make the relationship between Abby and Lev somewhat organic. Try to make the circumstances around it more natural, as Joel and Ellie had. It felt flat. Nobody, and I mean nobody, fell for that. Nobody felt for Lev. Nobody felt for Abby because it was hollow. Everybody could see through that. There are many ways that they could have made that more interesting, but again, that was a few years ago. Why are we talking about it? Let's give Neil Druckmann and the team benefit of the doubt. Maybe they tried to stay, even-handed, but wanted a clear point of view from one side. Maybe in real life they feel for both sides, and more resolution with peace and talks. Maybe death of over 7,000 children at the time of this recording in Palestine and Gaza would mean waving flags for both countries, calling for ceasefire, supporting for aid. So on October 7th, Neil Druckmann posts Israeli flag, saying, always eternity. Okay, he's a nationalist. He would always support his country, no matter what his country does. In whatever inhumane ways Israel does, whatever it does. Okay. Idea of breaking many international UN laws, admitting them, boasting about them online, blatantly lying and then getting exposed. But what prompts Neil to tweet? Not all of that, not all of the others that I mentioned. He tweets about a made-up news regarding babies getting a story that had no truth, a story when people demanded the proof of, because they were actively saying that journalists have seen him with their own eyes, and when people in the public demanded pictures, demanded proof, the IDF does release a picture, and it was then proven to be AI generated. Then they backtrack. White House backtracks. People backtrack, and then they just change it to, oh no, the other side is doing that. And then he takes his tweets down. From day one, it has always been Hamas. Why schools are being bombed? Hamas is hiding under. Why hospitals are being bombed? Hamas. They're hiding under. Even the Baptist hospital, which isn't even theirs, Hamas is hiding under, bro. What prompts Neil Druckmann to post him still backing his words, even though it is confirmed that the news that made him all so angry was false? Instead of saying, I'm glad that didn't happen, but I feel for the babies on the other side that are actually dying. He backs his own words, and only after so much pressure, backlash, this time from everyone, even his own fans, he turns off his replies and still doesn't have a courtesy to write something of his own. From his own words, he uses someone else's statement where they're praying and hoping for peace for, quote, both sides, and they're heart aching for both sides, man. And then even after more pressure, people calling him out, so a couple days ago he donates to both sides, as that was his final take on all this. In my opinion, he's not at any small position. He's the head of creative and co-studio head at Naughty Dog. He's climbing the ladder I'm sure he worked hard and decades for outsiders. Was that all of that warranted from his social media? If he truly believes in peace for both sides, if he truly believes the message of the game he created himself, maybe he would start seeing the other sides as human just as much as his own. And if you're not feeling for the people there, at least feel for the 50% of infants on incubators that died in the hospital. Kids stuck under rubbles. Those who lost their limbs, legs, arms. They were not part of the attack on October 7th, but they sure were the babies and kids of the oppressed people before October 7th. Maybe after feeling tired and exhausted from literally losing every single member of your family, losing your home, using your land, having nothing to your name, maybe you finally go, or maybe they finally go, you know what, let me hit back, but I have this frustration and anger in me. What do you think is gonna happen? A child who lost everything, the minute he gets the opportunity to pick up a gun, he will. So maybe Naughty Dog, maybe Neil Druckmann, start right there. Start feeling for the kids. The reason many of us stand for Palestine and their rights is purely because everywhere else, Israel gets full coverage, backing, and support. Now, for their innocent people who are dying, rightly so. But when it comes to Palestine and how they're being brutally massacred and their entire city being flattened, and the injuries and brutalities and the oppression that they've been suffering, not just right now, but for over 75 years, all the people that are now waving the Israeli flag. But if you're not gonna feel for them, who are going through worse, you don't feel for them, you don't mention them, or you don't even acknowledge the innocence on the other side, then you're not just supporting your own culture, country, ideology, religion. You're not nationalist. You don't have a moral high ground. You're just a hypocrite, a genocide supporter, double standard, two-face, responding to only the negative noise around you. They're also humans. They also deserve their peace, their voice, their land, and their lives. None of those who lost their lives deserve to die like that. And to bring the point back to Naughty Dog and Neil Druckmann, I really hope the lessons are learned and we go back to peace, love, and creating, enjoying human stories rather than pushing agendas and political beliefs. I will be keeping my eye on Last of Us Part 3 and anything Naughty Dog put, but I would like to end this video with 2 points from Vice article.
And the same can be said about Israel and Palestine. The difference is that when flashes of violence abate and the smoke clears, one side continues to live freely and prosper, while the other goes back to a life of occupation and humiliation. One side continues to expand while the other continues to lose the land it needs to live. Critically, by not asking these questions, and by masking its point of view as being even-handed, it perpetuates the very cycles of violence it's supposedly so troubled by.